The beeping was the first thing I heard. A steady, relentless rhythm that seemed to measure out the fragile seconds of my son's life. The smell was sterile and sharp, like cleaning products and fear. I was standing in the pediatric intensive care unit, my hands pressed against the cold, clear plastic of an incubator. Inside was Caleb, my baby, my miracle. He was 6 weeks old and he was so still. Tubes snaked from his nose and taped down tiny hands. A machine was breathing for him. My husband, Mark, was slumped in a chair in the corner, his face pale and smudged with exhaustion. For 12 years we had prayed for this child. We had cried, we had begged God, we had endured baby showers for friends and the silent agony of another negative test. We had filled a nursery with hope, one tiny sock and stuffed animal at a time. And now, here he was, the answer to 1,000 prayers, and the doctors were using words like infection and meningitis and critical condition. A scream was building in my chest, a raw, silent thing made of every single month of disappointment, every whispered prayer, every ounce of faith I thought I had. It felt like God had given me the one thing I wanted most, just to show me how easily he could take it away. I looked from Caleb's small, motionless body to Mark's broken posture, and the scream turned into words that shattered the quiet of my own heart. Can't do this. I don't believe you are good. The thought was so terrifying, so blasphemous, that my knees almost buckled. My faith, the thing I had built my entire life upon, felt like a sandcastle facing a tidal wave. And in that moment, staring at my dying son, I let the wave crash over me. I let it all go. But to understand how I got here, I need to take you back to where it all began. It started in a little yellow house on Maple Street in Boise, Idaho. I was 28. Mark was 29. We'd been married for 4 years, and we decided it was time to start a family. We were so naive. We thought it would be as simple as deciding. I remember telling Mark, I think we should have a baby, over a dinner of spaghetti, and he grinned a big, goofy grin and said, yeah. Let's do it. We pictured a Christmas card with a baby in a stocking, maybe by next year. We had no idea that the word try could become a decade-long battle, a war waged in doctors' offices and on our knees. The first year was fun, full of hope and not a single worry. The second year, the worry started to creep in. We started tracking things, taking temperatures. The third year, we found ourselves in a specialist's office with beige walls and diagrams of fallopian tubes. That's when the real journey began. The years that followed were a blur of procedures with clinical names, of injections that left bruises on my stomach, of hope so sharp it felt like a knife every time it was dashed. We'd get our hopes up, we'd pray with a feverish intensity, and then the phone would ring with the results. I'm so sorry, Jennifer. It's negative. Each time felt like a little death. I watched my friends have their first and then their second babies. I smiled at their showers and held their newborns, all while feeling a hollow ache deep inside me that nothing could fill. Before I continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location and what time it is where you are in the comments. It means the world to me to know who's hearing this story. Mark and I, we changed during those years. The easy laughter that used to fill our house got quieter. We stopped talking about baby names. We started going to church and feeling like ghosts, surrounded by families that seemed to have gotten the one thing we were being denied. I remember one Sunday, a woman was dedicating her newborn to God up at the front, and everyone was smiling and crying happy tears. I had to get up and walk out. I sat in my car and sobbed, pounding my fists on the steering wheel. Why not us, God? I yelled into the empty car. What's wrong with us? Don't you love us? There was no answer. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant church bells. I threw myself into work. Mark buried himself in home renovation projects, fixing up the little yellow house room by room, as if by building a perfect home he could will a family to appear in it. We were a team, but we were a team fighting a silent, losing war. We'd lie in bed at night, back to back, both of us pretending to be asleep. The distance between us felt wider than the king-sized mattress we shared. We were drowning in our own private grief, too hurt and too tired to reach out and save each other. And then, after 8 years of this, something shifted. It wasn't a big, dramatic moment. It was a quiet Tuesday. I was in the grocery store, pushing my cart past the baby aisle, and I didn't feel the usual stab of pain. I just felt numb, tired. That night I told Mark, I think I need to stop. I can't do the treatments anymore. It's killing me. He looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the same exhaustion reflected in his eyes. He just nodded and pulled me into a hug. We held each other in the kitchen for a long time, not saying a word. We were giving up. We decided to look into adoption, but the process seemed so huge, so expensive, so uncertain. We felt stuck in a permanent state of waiting. That's when the bitterness really took root. It was a slow poison. I stopped praying for a baby. I started just going through the motions at church, singing the songs but feeling nothing. I was angry at God, angry at my body, angry at the world for being so full of children. I felt like he had forgotten me, like my name had been crossed off some heavenly list. Mark tried to keep us positive, but I could see the hope fading from him too. We were just going through the motions of life. Two people living in a quiet, clean house that felt emptier with every passing year. And then a miracle. The kind you stop believing in. It was a Sunday morning, about 4 years after we'd stopped all the treatments. I was 39. I'd been feeling unusually tired and a little queasy for a week, but I chalked it up to a bug or maybe the stress of a big project at work. I was getting ready for church, and I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked different. My body, which I had spent over a decade resenting for its failure, felt unfamiliar. A wild, impossible thought flickered in my mind. No, I told myself firmly. Don't you dare. Don't open that door. Hope is too dangerous. But the thought wouldn't leave. After church, while Mark was mowing the lawn, I drove to the pharmacy. I bought a test, the 2-pack, just like I had 100 times before. My hands shook as I opened the box in the bathroom at home. I went through the familiar heart-wrenching routine, my stomach a tight knot of dread and that tiny, treacherous spark of hope. I set the stick on the edge of the sink and set a timer on my phone for 3 minutes. I couldn't look. I walked out of the bathroom and paced the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. I prayed for the first time in months, a desperate one-word prayer. Please. The timer went off. I walked back into the bathroom, my eyes squeezed shut. I took a deep breath and opened them. And there it was. Not the single, lonely line I had grown to expect. Not the no that had defined my 30s. But 2 lines. Clear, pink, undeniable plus sign. I stumbled back, grabbing the counter for support. I picked up the stick with trembling hands, staring at it as if I could change what it said. I fumbled for the second test. My movements frantic. I did it again. Same result. 2 lines. Plus sign. Pregnant. A sound escaped my lips. Something between a sob and a laugh. I sank to the cold tile floor, clutching the little plastic stick, the truth of it washing over me in a wave of pure, unadulterated joy. 12 years. 4,380 days of praying, of crying, of hoping. And here, in the most ordinary way, on a sunny Sunday afternoon on my bathroom floor, was the answer. I found Mark outside. His face sweaty and smudged with dirt from the lawn. I didn't say anything. I just held out my hand, the test resting on my palm. He looked at it, then at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. Then, understanding dawned on his face. His eyes went wide, and the old goofy grin I hadn't seen in years spread across his face. He whooped, a loud, joyful sound that echoed through the backyard, and swept me up in a hug, spinning me around and around. We were crying and laughing, 2 broken people suddenly feeling whole. We prayed together, right there on the grass, tears streaming down our faces, thanking God for this impossible, incredible gift. Felt like a resurrection. Like every prayer had been saved up and answered in one glorious moment. The pregnancy was perfect. Every kick, every ultrasound, every checkup was a celebration. We painted the nursery a soft sky blue. We named him Caleb because it meant faithful. Our church celebrated with us. We were a living testament to God's faithfulness, the couple who never gave up. My faith, which had been a shriveled, brittle thing, bloomed again, lush and green and strong. I believed with every fiber of my being that God had saved this miracle just for us, that the long wait had been to make the reward even sweeter. I thought the hard part was over. I had no idea that the hardest part, the part that would threaten to shatter my world completely, was still to come, waiting for us in a sterile hospital room, measured by the relentless beeping of a machine. The first month of Caleb's life was a blur of sleepless nights and a joy so profound it felt like a physical warmth in my chest. I'd spend hours just watching him sleep, tracing the perfect curve of his cheek with my finger, marveling at his tiny fingernails. The smell of him, that sweet, milky baby scent, mixed with the lavender lotion we used after his baths, became the aroma of answered prayer. Mark would come home from work, drop his bag by the door, and immediately take Caleb from my arms, holding him up to look into his eyes. "Hey there, little man," he'd whisper, his voice thick with a love I hadn't heard in years. Our house, once so quiet and empty, was now filled with the gurgles, coos, and occasional wails of new life. The nursery, with its sky-blue walls and mobile of drifting clouds, felt like the heart of our home. I remember one afternoon I was rocking Caleb to sleep, humming a old hymn my grandmother used to sing. The sun was streaming through the window, painting a golden square on the floor. I looked down at his peaceful, trusting face, his little body heavy with sleep in my arms, and a wave of gratitude so strong it stole my breath washed over me. "Thank you," I whispered, my eyes filling with tears. This time they were happy tears. All the years of pain, the negative tests, the bitter nights, they all seemed to melt away in the face of this perfect little person. I felt like God had not only given me a son but had restored the years the locusts had eaten. My faith felt unshakable, a solid rock after a long storm. But storms have a way of circling back. Started small. Caleb was about 5 weeks old. He'd been a little fussier than usual, not nursing as well. I chalked it up to a growth spurt. "He's just a growing boy," I told Mark, pushing down a tiny flutter of anxiety. "New mom jitters," I told myself. "Everyone gets them." But the fussiness turned into a weak, miserable cry that was different from his hungry or tired cry. He felt warm, too warm. I dug out the baby thermometer we'd gotten at our shower, still in its box. His temperature was 100.8. I called the nurse line, my voice only slightly shaky. "For a baby under 2 months, any fever is an automatic trip to the ER," the calm voice on the other end said. "Don't wait for your pediatrician. Go now." The drive to the hospital was a nightmare painted in the garish colors of streetlights and neon signs. Mark drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, while I sat in the back with Caleb, who was now listless in his car seat. His cries reduced to weak whimpers. I kept pressing my lips to his forehead, which was burning up. "It's probably just a virus," Mark said, more to himself than to me. "It's gonna be okay." But his eyes, flicking to me in the rearview mirror, were scared. The ER was a chaotic whirlwind of bright lights and hurried footsteps. They took us back immediately, which I knew was both a good and a bad sign. Good that they were taking it seriously. Bad that it was serious enough to warrant it. A young doctor with tired eyes examined Caleb, his hands moving with a practiced efficiency. He asked us a dozen questions about his feedings, his diapers, his behavior. When he felt the soft spot on Caleb's head, his expression changed, just for a fraction of a second. It was a subtle tightening around his mouth, a slight narrowing of his eyes. "But a mother sees everything. I'm concerned about the possibility of meningitis," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Given his age and his symptoms, we need to do a lumbar puncture, spinal tap, to test the fluid around his spine." The world seemed to tilt. Meningitis. The word echoed in my mind, cold and clinical and terrifying. I heard stories. I looked at Caleb, so small on the big hospital bed, and the thought of a needle going into his tiny spine made me feel like I was going to be sick. Mark's hand found mine, and he squeezed it so hard it hurt. Is that necessary?" he asked, his voice rough. "It's necessary," the doctor said gently. "We have to know what we're dealing with." What followed was the longest hour of my life up to that point. They made us wait outside the room while they performed the procedure. We stood in the sterile hallway, listening to the muffled sound of our baby's cries from behind the closed door. Each cry was a shard of glass in my heart. Mark leaned his forehead against the cool, painted cinderblock wall, his shoulders shaking. I just stood there, frozen, my arms wrapped around myself, praying the same 3 words over and over in my head. Please, God. Please, please. When they finally let us back in, Caleb was sleeping, exhausted, an ugly bandage on his back. He looked even smaller and more vulnerable than before. They admitted him to the pediatric intensive care unit. They said it was just a precaution that they could monitor him more closely there, but the name itself was a threat. Intensive care. They started him on strong antibiotics right away, 3 and 4 in his tiny hand. We're treating it as bacterial meningitis until the tests come back and tell us otherwise. A new doctor, a woman with a kind but no-nonsense face, told us. The antibiotics are broad spectrum. They should cover the most likely causes. The first 24 hours in the PICU were a strange, suspended state of existence. Caleb's fever would dip and then spike again. He was irritable, hard to console. But he was still nursing a little. He was still my Caleb. Clung to that. Mark and I took turns sitting by his plastic bassinet, holding his little hand through the portholes. We told each other it was just a scare, that the antibiotics would work, that our miracle baby was tough. We were tired, running on adrenaline and desperate hope. Then, on the second night, everything changed. I was holding Caleb, trying to get him to nurse, when his body suddenly went rigid in my arms. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his little arms and legs began to jerk in a rhythmic, terrifying way. Seizure. I screamed for a nurse. The room exploded with activity. People in scrubs came running. They took Caleb from me, laid him on the bed, and started doing things, saying words I couldn't understand. Mark held me back, his arms like a vice around me, as we watched our son's small body be racked by forces we couldn't control. The seizure only lasted a minute, maybe 2, but it felt like an eternity. When it was over, Caleb lay completely still, pale and limp. The doctor's face was grim. The infection is causing swelling in his brain. The seizure is a sign of that. His body is struggling to fight this. She looked from me to Mark, her expression full of a pity I never wanted to see directed at my family. I need to be honest with you. He's a very sick little boy. We're going to have to intubate him, put him on a ventilator to help him breathe and give his body a chance to rest and fight. That's how we ended up here. In this room with the relentless beeping. Me standing at the incubator, looking at my son who was no longer my vibrant miracle baby, but a small, silent patient kept alive by machines. The doctors had confirmed it was bacterial meningitis, the kind that could cause brain damage. The kind that could. I looked at Mark, broken in the chair. I looked at Caleb, motionless in the plastic box. And the foundation of my faith, so recently rebuilt, crumbled into dust. The happy ending I thought God had written was a cruel joke. He'd given me my heart's desire only to rip it away. The prayers I'd prayed for 12 years felt like they were being thrown back in my face. I leaned my forehead against the cold plastic of the incubator. The words I formed in my mind were the most honest prayer I'd ever prayed. I trusted you. Thanked you. And this is what you do. I didn't feel God's presence. I didn't feel peace. I just felt a vast, howling emptiness. The beeping of the monitors sounded like a countdown to a loss I didn't think I could survive. And then a nurse named Anna, who had kind eyes and a quiet demeanor, touched my arm. "Jennifer," she said softly. "You should talk to him. He can hear you. Tell him you're here." Felt pointless. What good were my words against this? But I had nothing else left. I opened my mouth, not knowing what would come out, my voice a cracked whisper in the humming, beeping silence. My voice, when it finally came, was a ragged scrap of sound. "I'm here, Caleb. Mommy's here." The words felt stupid and useless. What did he care about my presence when his own body was betraying him? But I kept talking because the nurse, Anna, was still watching me with those calm, knowing eyes, and because I had absolutely nothing else to offer my son. I told him about the silly dog next door that chased its own tail. I told him about the sky-blue walls of his nursery, waiting for him. I whispered the words to that old hymn my grandmother sang, my voice cracking on the high notes. Mark eventually stirred from his chair and came to stand beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. He didn't try to pray out loud. He just rested his large, calloused hand on top of the incubator, as if he could transfer his own strength through the plastic. The days blurred into a nightmare routine. The beeping of the monitors became the soundtrack of our lives. We learned to read the numbers on the screens. His heart rate, his oxygen saturation, the pressure in his brain. They were a terrifying language that told us whether he was having a good minute or a bad minute. We existed in a small, sterile world defined by hushed voices, the smell of antiseptic, and the constant low-grade terror that the next phone call from the lab would bring worse news. My prayers, when they came, were no longer gentle whispers of gratitude. They were accusations, hurled into the silence. You could stop this with a word. Why don't you? I'd look at the cross on the wall of the hospital chapel and feel nothing but a cold anger. It felt like a symbol of absence, not presence. Mark handled it differently. He didn't seem angry. He was just steadfast. He'd leave for an hour and come back with coffee and sandwiches I wouldn't eat. He'd talk to the doctors, remembering every detail, when I could barely remember my own name. His faith became a quiet, practical thing. He'd simply say, "We're gonna get through this, Jen," and then he'd go refill our water bottles. The difference between us started to feel like a canyon. One night, after a particularly long day where Caleb's blood pressure had dipped dangerously low, I couldn't take it anymore. We were in the family lounge, a bleak room with worn-out couches and a vending machine that hummed too loudly. "How can you just say that?" I snapped, my voice trembling. "How can you just say we're gonna get through this? What if we don't? What if he—" I couldn't say the word. Mark looked up from the coffee he was stirring. He had deep, purple bruises under his eyes. "What else can I do, Jen? I can't fall apart. You're falling apart enough for both of us." The words hung in the air, sharp and true. He wasn't saying it to be cruel. He was stating a fact. My grief, my terror, my raging at God. It was a storm he was constantly navigating around. "So my grief is an inconvenience for you?" I shot back, my anger finding a new target. "That's not what I meant," he sighed, the sound heavy with exhaustion. I have to believe God is still here. Even in this. If I stop believing that, I'll collapse right next to you on this gross carpet. And then who will be strong for Caleb? "Maybe God isn't here, Mark," I said, my voice rising. "Maybe we were fools to think he ever was. Maybe the 12 years of silence was the real answer. And this is just the cruel punchline." Saying it out loud felt like tearing a scab off my soul. It was terrifying and liberating. Mark just looked at me, his eyes full of a pain so deep I had to look away. He didn't argue. He didn't quote a Bible verse. He just reached out and took my hand. I tried to pull away, but he held on tight. We sat there in the humming silence, not speaking, our hands clasped together in a lifeline of shared despair. We were on the same sinking ship, but we were looking at the storm in completely different ways. It was the third morning of Caleb's intubation. The doctor had just told us the initial bacteria cultures showed a particularly aggressive strain. The word long-term neurological effects was used. I felt the last shred of hope I'd been clinging to dissolve. I walked out of the room, past the nursing station, and found a deserted stairwell. I sank onto the cold concrete steps and finally let the tears come, great, heaving sobs that felt like they were tearing me apart from the inside. I wasn't just crying for Caleb. I was crying for the 12 years of waiting, for the brokenness in my marriage, for the faith that felt like a lie. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was my grandmother, Nana, the one who had sung the hymn. I almost didn't answer. I didn't have the energy to pretend I was okay. But I swiped the screen anyway. "Hi, Nana," I said, my voice thick with tears. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't offer a platitude. She just said, I'm sitting in my rocking chair, Jennifer. And I'm holding you and that beautiful boy in my heart before the Lord. That's all I'm doing. Something about the simplicity of it, the lack of any easy answers, broke me open all over again. I can't do this, Nana, I whispered. I'm so angry. I feel like he's betrayed me. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear the gentle creak of her rocking chair. Tell him, she said finally, her voice soft but firm. He's big enough to handle it, child. Job screamed at God. David raged. Tell him the truth of your heart. You can't heal what you won't expose to the air. I hung up a few minutes later, feeling raw but strangely lighter. I walked back to the PICU, the echo of my grandmother's words in my mind. When I reached Caleb's room, I saw Mark through the window. He was standing by the incubator, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. But his lips were moving. He was praying. And in that moment, I didn't feel anger at his faith. I felt a desperate, aching longing for it. I walked in and went to the other side of the incubator. I looked at my son, at the tube taped to his mouth, at the machines doing the work his tiny body couldn't. And I decided to take Nana's advice. I leaned close to the plastic, my voice a low, raw whisper, meant for God and for Caleb. I am so angry at you, I began, the words feeling dangerous and true. I feel like you tricked us. You gave us this incredible gift and then you turned your back. Feels cruel. And I don't understand. I don't believe you are good right now. I don't believe you are here. But Mark does. And Nana does. And I want to. I just don't know how. It wasn't a pretty prayer. It wasn't faithful. It was a mess. But it was honest. And as I stood there, spent and empty, a strange thing happened. Nothing changed. The monitors kept beeping. Caleb lay still. But the tight, furious knot in my chest felt just a little bit looser. It was as if I had opened a valve and let some of the poison out. Just then Anna, the nurse, came in to check the 4-line. She looked at me, and her eyes seemed to see right through to the quiet storm that had just passed. She didn't smile. She just nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if she understood. She finished her work and then paused at the door. The afternoon shift is starting, she said quietly. There's a new respiratory therapist on tonight. His name is Ben. He's one of the best. She looked directly at me. He's also a pastor at a little church on the south side. He's a man who has seen a lot of hard things and still chooses to believe. She left, and her words hung in the air. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a miracle. It was just a piece of information. But it felt like the first small, fragile thread of something being thrown to me in the raging water. I looked at Mark, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes that wasn't just exhaustion or grim determination. It was a tiny, tentative spark of hope. The door to the room swung open again, and a man in blue scrubs walked in, a chart in his hand. He had a kind, weathered face and calm eyes. He introduced himself, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I'm Ben," the man said, his voice as calm and steady as his hands, which were already moving to check the connections on the ventilator. "I'll be handling Caleb's respiratory care tonight." He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't look at us with pity. He just looked at Caleb, his gaze taking in every tube and wire with a professional, yet deeply personal attention. "Okay, little guy," he murmured, almost to himself. "Let's see how you're doing." Mark and I watched him, two statues held captive by hope and fear. Ben worked with a quiet efficiency, adjusting settings, checking the readings, his movements gentle and precise. He spoke to Caleb the whole time, not in baby talk, but in a low, reassuring tone, explaining what he was doing as if our 6-week-old could understand. "Just going to suction this tube a bit, Caleb. Gotta keep those airways clear. You might feel a little cough. That's a good thing." After a few minutes, he turned to us. His lungs are sounding a little clearer than the day shift report indicated. That's a good sign. The antibiotics are starting to do their job against the infection. The real battle now is the swelling in his brain. He met our eyes, his gaze direct and honest. It's a precarious balance. The ventilator is giving his body a rest, but his little system is under a tremendous assault. The doctor mentioned neurological damage, Mark said, the words tasting like ash. Ben nodded slowly, not dismissing the fear. It's a possibility we have to be aware of. The brain is resilient, especially in someone so young, but it's also incredibly vulnerable. He paused, looking back at Caleb. All we can do right now is support him through this fight. And pray. Not just for healing but for peace. For his peace, and for yours. The way he said it didn't feel like a sermon. It felt like a veteran soldier telling two new recruits what to expect in the trenches. He wasn't promising a victory. He was promising to stand with us in the battle. Over the next few hours, Ben became a quiet anchor in the storm. He came in regularly. His presence a constant calming force. He didn't try to force conversation, but when we spoke, he listened, really listened. I found myself telling him about the 12 years of waiting, about the positive test on the bathroom floor, about the joy that now felt like a prelude to a greater pain. It feels like a betrayal, I confessed, my voice low. Like God built me up just to knock me down harder. Ben was adjusting a monitor. He didn't look up right away. My wife and I lost our first child, he said quietly. 20 weeks in. A little girl we named Hope. The simplicity of the statement, the raw truth of it, sucked the air from the room. I remember screaming in the hospital parking lot. I told God he was a thief. I told him I hated him. He finally looked at me, and in his eyes I saw my own reflection, a soul scarred by a similar searing pain. It took me a long time to realize that my anger wasn't a sign of a lack of faith. It was a sign that I was still engaging with him. The opposite of faith isn't doubt, or even anger. It's indifference. And you, Jennifer, are not indifferent. His words settled deep inside me, shifting something fundamental. My rage, my accusations, they weren't disqualifying me from God's presence. They were my way of clawing my way toward him through the pain. Later that night, during one of his checks, Ben noticed Caleb's oxygen levels dipping slightly. He worked quickly, his hands sure and steady. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. "Breathe with me now." Mark had gone down to the cafeteria to force some food into his body, and I was alone with Ben and the beeping machines. As he worked, he began to hum. It was a simple, familiar tune, one I hadn't heard in years. It was, "It is well with my soul." The irony was so thick it was almost cruel. How could anyone sing that song in this room? My soul was not well. It was in torment. But as he hummed, the story of the hymn washed over me, something I'd learned in Sunday school long ago. The man who wrote it had lost his entire family in a shipwreck. He had written those words not from a place of comfort, but from the depths of an ocean of grief. When peace like a river attendeth my way. Ben wasn't humming because everything was well. He was humming in defiance of the storm, a declaration that somehow, even here, God was present. The notes weren't a mask for the pain. They were woven through it. Tears began to stream down my face, silent and hot. They weren't tears of anger this time. They were tears of release, of a burden shared. I looked at Caleb, and for the first time I didn't just see a sick baby. I saw a child who was known and loved by God, even here in this plastic box. My prayer changed. It was no longer, "Why are you doing this?" It became a ragged, desperate whisper. "I can't see you. I can't feel you. But if you are here, help me. Help him. Help Mark." Nothing miraculous happened. Caleb didn't sit up. The machines kept beeping. But the icy fortress around my heart cracked. Just a little. A sliver of light got in. When Mark returned, his face pale with exhaustion, he stopped in the doorway, his eyes going from my tear-streaked face to Ben, who was now writing in Caleb's chart. "Everything okay?" Mark asked, his voice tight with fresh alarm. I nodded, wiping my cheeks with the back of my hand. Yeah, I said, and for the first time it wasn't a complete lie. Ben was just helping. Mark really looked at me and saw the shift. The defiant anger in my eyes had been replaced by a weary, vulnerable hope. He came to my side and put his arm around me, pulling me close. We stood together, watching our son, watching Ben work, listening to the hum of the machinery that was keeping our world turning. Ben finished his notes and prepared to leave. I'll be back in a few hours, he said. He's stable for now. Try to get some rest. Both of you. After he left, the room felt different. The silence wasn't as heavy. The beeps weren't as accusatory. What happened? Mark asked softly. I began searching for the words. I think I finally told God the truth. And the world didn't end. Mark squeezed my shoulder. For the first time in days, we weren't standing on opposite sides of a chasm. We were standing together in the middle of it, looking up at the same small patch of sky. We decided to take turns trying to sleep in the family lounge. I went first, leaving Mark in the chair by Caleb's incubator. As I walked down the bright, silent hallway, the image of Ben humming over my son stayed with me. It was a quiet miracle. Not a healing of the body, but a suturing of a torn spirit. I fell into a fitful sleep on a stiff couch, my dreams filled with the sound of a familiar hymn playing in a sterile room. I was woken by the sound of my name. It was Mark. His hand was on my shoulder, shaking me gently. My eyes flew open, my heart instantly in my throat. The look on his face was unreadable, a strange mix of anxiety and something else. Jen, he said, his voice urgent. You need to come. Now. I scrambled to my feet, my blood running cold. What is it? What's wrong? It's the lab, he said, taking my hand and pulling me toward the hallway. The final meningitis results are back. The doctor is in with Caleb now. She needs to talk to us. We hurried down the hallway, our footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn quiet. My mind was racing, conjuring every terrible possibility. The final results. Did that mean they knew how bad the damage was? Did it mean the bacteria was resistant to the antibiotics? My hand in Mark's was slick with sweat. The doctor was waiting for us outside Caleb's room. Her face was serious, but her eyes held a hint of something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the grim finality I'd been expecting. Jennifer, Mark, she began, holding a clipboard. The full panel of tests is back. It confirms bacterial meningitis, as we thought, but it's given us two critical pieces of information. She took a breath. First, the specific strain is one that responds very well to the exact antibiotic cocktail we started him on 48 hours ago. That's excellent news. We're already using the right weapon. I felt a fraction of the tension in my shoulders release. Mark's grip on my hand tightened. And the second? He asked, his voice rough. The doctor's gaze softened. The second is that the viral load, the amount of active bacteria in his spinal fluid, is significantly lower than we would expect at this stage. It's a dramatic drop. It means his body, with the help of the medication, is winning the fight against the infection faster than we anticipated. I stared at her, waiting for the but. It didn't come. So, what does that mean? I asked, afraid to hope. It means the immediate, life-threatening part of this crisis is receding, she said. His vital signs have stabilized through the night. His fever broke about an hour ago. We're not out of the woods. The concern about neurological impact remains until the swelling goes down completely and we can assess him. But the trend is positive. Very positive. I leaned against the wall, my legs suddenly weak. Mark put his arm around me, holding me up. Thank you, doctor, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We're going to keep him sedated and on the ventilator for at least another 24 hours to let his brain rest, she continued. But if he continues to improve at this rate, we can start talking about weaning him off it tomorrow. She left us then, the swish of her coat a sound of hope instead of dread. Mark and I turned to each other. The fear and exhaustion on his face were now mingled with a disbelieving joy. He pulled me into a full hug, burying his face in my hair, and I felt his body shake with silent sobs of relief. We stood there in the hallway, holding each other up for a long time. When we went back into the room, it looked the same. Caleb was still in the incubator, still on the ventilator, still surrounded by beeping machines. But everything felt different. The air was lighter. The beeps sounded less like a countdown and more like a steady, reassuring heartbeat. We were no longer staring into an abyss. We were looking at a long, difficult road, but one that now had a destination we could actually reach. The next 24 hours were a lesson in cautious hope. We watched the numbers on the screens like hawks, celebrating every small positive sign. His heart rate was a little stronger. His oxygen levels held steady. The nurse, Anna, confirmed that his neurological readings were showing less distress. Ben came back for his shift that evening. When we told him the news, a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "That's our fighter," he said, looking at Caleb. He did his checks, his humming now a quiet soundtrack of celebration. Before he left, he placed a hand on Mark's shoulder and then on mine. "Remember this moment," he said softly. "Remember this feeling of grace when the road gets hard again. Because it will. Healing is a journey, not a single event." His words were a gentle anchor, keeping our soaring hopes from flying too high and getting lost. He was right. We still had no idea what the future held for Caleb's development, for our family, for the scars this would leave on all of us. The following morning, the team decided it was time to try and wake Caleb up. The process was slow and careful. They reduced the sedatives dripping into his fore. Mark and I stood on either side of the incubator, barely breathing, our eyes glued to his face. Felt like waiting for him to be born all over again. The first thing he did was grimace, a tiny wrinkled frown. Then his fingers, the ones without the fore, twitched. My heart leaped into my throat. After what felt like an eternity, his eyelids fluttered. They opened slowly, unfocused and hazy from the drugs and the ordeal. He was looking at the bright lights of the room, his gaze wandering. Then, slowly, his head turned just a fraction. His bleary, dark blue eyes found mine. He looked at me. He saw me. A sound escaped me, a cross between a gasp and a sob. I reached my hand through the porthole and gently touched his foot. "Hi, baby," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Mommy's here." He didn't smile. He was too weak, too overwhelmed. But he held my gaze for a long, precious moment before his eyes drifted shut again, succumbing to exhaustion. It was enough. It was everything. Later that day, they successfully removed the breathing tube. The first raw, raspy cry he let out was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of life, of fight, of a future. They moved him out of the PICU and into a regular pediatric room. Felt like graduating. We spent another week in the hospital. Caleb was weak and fussy, struggling to nurse and easily overwhelmed. He had to stay on a course of strong antibiotics through the 4 in his hand. He was a far cry from the robust baby we had brought in, but he was alive. He was present. We brought him home on a Tuesday. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The little yellow house on Maple Street had never looked more beautiful. Mark carried the car seat inside, handling Caleb as if he were made of the most delicate glass. I followed, my knees weak with a mixture of joy and residual terror. We took him into the nursery. The sky-blue walls, the drifting cloud mobile, the stacks of clean diapers. It was all exactly as we had left it, but it felt like a different universe. We were different people. We laid him down in his crib, and he looked so small in it, smaller than he had before all this started. That first night home I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Mark, listening to the baby monitor, straining to hear every little sigh and snuffle from Caleb's room. Every quiet sound felt like a miracle. The fear was still there, a ghost in the corner of the room, whispering about what might have been and what challenges might still lie ahead. My faith felt tender, like a limb that had been broken and was now in a cast. healing but fragile and unable to bear much weight. After a while, I got up and went into Caleb's room. I stood over his crib, watching the steady, peaceful rise and fall of his chest in the dim light from the hallway. The rage was gone. The feeling of betrayal had receded. But in its place was a vast, quiet uncertainty. I had prayed for a child for 12 years. I had almost lost him. And I had almost lost my faith in the process. I reached down and laid my hand on his back, feeling the warmth of his skin, the reality of him. He was here. He was ours. But as I stood there in the quiet dark, a single terrifying question began to form in the back of my mind, a question for which I had no answer, a question that threatened to overshadow the fragile joy of our homecoming. What if the miracle was only half finished? What if the child we fought so hard to bring home was forever changed by the battle? The ghost of the hospital lived with us in the little yellow house. It was in the way I jumped at every little sound, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was in the collection of medicine bottles on the kitchen counter, a daily reminder of the war Caleb's tiny body had endured. It was in the silence between Mark and me, a silence that was no longer just about grief, but now also about a fear we were both too terrified to name out loud. Caleb was home, but he wasn't the same baby. The doctor had warned us he might be irritable, might have trouble feeding, might be delayed. Hearing the words was one thing. Living them was another. He cried for hours, a high-pitched, pained wail that nothing could soothe. He arched his back when I tried to hold him, as if my touch was fire. Breastfeeding, which had been difficult before, became a battleground. He would latch and then pull away, screaming. His little body rigid with frustration and what I could only imagine was lingering pain. I spent my days and nights in a cycle of rocking, shushing, trying to feed, and crying along with him. The profound joy of his homecoming was quickly buried under an avalanche of exhaustion and a new, specific kind of fear. The fear that the infection had stolen the child we were supposed to have. Mark tried to help. He'd take Caleb from me during his screaming fits, walking him up and down the hallway, singing in a low, steady voice. But eventually, Caleb's cries would wear him down too, and he'd hand him back, a look of helpless defeat in his eyes before he retreated to the garage or to the mindless glow of the television. One afternoon, about a week after we'd been home, I was trying to get Caleb to take a bottle. He was refusing, turning his head, his cries growing more frantic. My shoulders were so tight they ached. The sun was streaming through the window, highlighting the dust on the furniture I hadn't had time to clean. The house was a mess. I was a mess. Just eat, Caleb. Please just eat, I begged, my voice breaking. He screamed louder, his face turning a mottled red. A wave of pure, hot frustration washed over me. It was so strong it scared me. I wanted to scream back. I wanted to put him down and run out the front door and never come back. The thought was so shameful I felt dizzy with it. This was the child I had prayed for. How could I be so angry at him? How could I be so incapable? I laid him gently, still screaming, in his bassinet and walked into the kitchen, gripping the edge of the sink until my knuckles turned white. I stared out the window at our quiet, normal street, where normal people were probably having a normal afternoon. I felt like I was on the other side of a glass wall, watching a world I no longer belonged to. God, I whispered, the word a ragged plea. I can't do this. I don't know how to be his mom. I'm failing him. There was no thunderous reply. But in the quiet that followed my desperate confession, a memory surfaced. It was Ben, the respiratory therapist, in the PICU. The opposite of faith isn't doubt, or even anger. It's indifference. I wasn't indifferent. I was drowning in the feeling of failure. But that meant I was still in the fight. My anger at God had been a cry for help. My frustration now was the same. It wasn't a pretty, faithful prayer. It was a guttural, honest one. I took a deep, shuddering breath and went back to the living room. Caleb's cries had subsided into exhausted whimpers. I picked him up, not with the frantic energy of before, but slowly, letting my body relax. I stopped trying to force the bottle. I just held him against my chest, His head tucked under my chin, and I started to walk. I didn't shush him. I didn't sing. I just walked and breathed in and out, letting my own heartbeat slow down. After a few minutes, I felt his little body start to loosen. The tension drained from his limbs, and he sank against me. His breathing evening out into the deep rhythmic pattern of sleep. It was the first time he had fallen asleep in my arms without a fight since coming home from the hospital. It was a small thing. Tiny, quiet miracle. But in that moment, it felt bigger than any of the dramatic prayers I'd prayed for 12 years. It wasn't God fixing everything. It was God giving me just enough strength, just enough peace for the next 5 minutes. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it would have to be enough. When Mark came in from the garage later, he found us both asleep on the couch, Caleb curled on my chest, my hand resting protectively on his back. He stopped and just watched us for a long moment. When I opened my eyes, I saw the tension in his face soften. "He's sleeping," he whispered, as if speaking too loud might break the spell. I nodded, careful not to move. He finally just gave in. Mark sat down on the floor beside the couch, leaning his head back against it, his shoulder touching my arm. We sat in the quiet for a long time, the three of us connected in a peace we hadn't known since before the world fell apart. That small victory didn't solve everything. The fussy evenings continued. The feeding struggles persisted. But something had shifted in me. I stopped seeing every cry as a potential symptom of brain damage, and started seeing it as the communication of a baby who had been through a trauma. I stopped demanding a return to the baby I thought I was supposed to have and started trying to learn the language of the baby I actually had. My prayers became simpler. Help me get through this feeding. Help me see one good thing today. Help Mark and me to be a team again. They were prayers for daily bread, not for a lifetime supply. One evening, I was bathing Caleb in the little plastic tub on the kitchen counter. He was watching the floating rubber ducky, his eyes wide. He wasn't smiling, but he was calm, present. I poured a cup of warm water over his back, and his little hand splashed at the surface. Mark came and stood beside me watching. "He's getting stronger," he said softly. "He is," I agreed. He put his arm around me, and I leaned into him. The gesture felt natural, easy, for the first time in months. We were looking at our son, not as a problem to be solved or a tragedy to be feared, but just as our son. A child who had fought a hard fight and was slowly finding his way home. Few days later the phone rang. It was the pediatrician's office, calling to schedule Caleb's 1-month follow-up with a specialist. A developmental pediatrician. The appointment was meant to establish a baseline, to see where he was after his illness. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. This was it. The moment we would get an official verdict. The moment we would find out just how much of our son had been lost in the sterile, beeping silence of the PICU. The ghost was back, whispering its terrible questions. I looked at Caleb, who was sleeping peacefully in his swing, and the fear rose in my throat like bile. The peaceful acceptance I'd found felt fragile, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark lake of what-ifs. The appointment was in 2 weeks. 2 weeks to wonder. 2 weeks to hope. 2 weeks to dread. I knew, with a sinking heart, that they were going to be the longest 2 weeks of my life. The 2 weeks waiting for the developmental appointment were a special kind of torture. Every moment with Caleb was now viewed through a lens of terrifying scrutiny. When he followed a rattle with his eyes, my heart would soar. He's tracking. That's good, right? When he lay still and quiet, not reaching for the toy dangled above him, my stomach would plummet. Is he lethargic? Is that a sign? I became an amateur neurologist, reading blog posts and parenting forums late into the night, comparing Caleb to charts and milestones he was already behind on because of his premature birth and his illness. The information was a swamp, and I was sinking in it. Mark handled the weight differently. He became a man of action. He built a detailed spreadsheet of Caleb's feeding times, sleep durations, and alert periods. He filmed short videos on his phone, Caleb gripping his finger, Caleb turning his head toward a noise. "We need data," he'd say, his voice tight with a focused anxiety. "We can't just go in there with feelings. We need facts." We were both terrified, but we were building our fortresses against the fear in different ways. Mine was made of frantic research. His of cold, hard data. The peaceful connection we'd found on the couch that day felt like a distant dream. We were back to being islands, separated by the same ocean of worry. The day of the appointment arrived. It was raining, a cold, gray drizzle that matched the mood in our car. The developmental pediatrician's office was in a modern medical building downtown. The waiting room was cheerful, filled with bright primary colors and toys, but it did nothing to lift the heavy dread sitting on my chest. Other parents sat with their children, and I found myself studying them, wondering what their stories were, what silent battles they were fighting. A nurse called us back. The doctor, Dr. Evans, was a woman in her 50s with a calm, unhurried demeanor and eyes that missed nothing. She shook our hands, her grip firm and sure. "Let's have a look at this famous fighter," she said, her voice warm as she looked at Caleb in my arms. She started by asking us to tell the story of his birth and his illness in our own words. We took turns, our sentences stumbling over each other, painting a picture of hope, terror, and fragile survival. She listened, nodding, occasionally making a note in her chart. She didn't interrupt. She just let us pour it all out. Then the examination began. It was nothing like a regular checkup. She put Caleb on a mat on the floor and watched him. She watched how he held his head, how he moved his arms and legs. She presented him with different objects, a red ring, a soft block, a small bell. She noted when he looked, when he reached, when he seemed uninterested. She tested his reflexes, his muscle tone, his startle response. It was thorough, and it was agonizing to watch. My son was being reduced to a series of clinical observations. Caleb, for his part, was having a bad day. He was fussy, turning his head away from the toys, his little body stiff with protest. Every time he failed to perform a task I knew he was capable of on a better day, I wanted to scream. "He can do it. I've seen him. He's just tired. He's scared." But I stayed silent, my nails digging half-moons into my palms. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Evans sat back. She looked at us, her expression thoughtful and unreadable. "Okay," she began, and my heart seized in my chest. Mark reached over and took my hand, his own cold and damp. "Based on today's assessment and the extensive records from his hospital stay, here is what I'm seeing." She picked up her chart. "Caleb is showing some significant developmental delays, particularly in his gross motor skills. His head control is weak for his adjusted age. His tone is a bit low in his trunk, which is common after a serious illness and a long hospital stay. He's also showing signs of sensory sensitivity, the fussiness, the aversion to certain stimuli. This is also not uncommon given what his little nervous system has been through." Each word felt like a hammer blow. "Delays, weak, low tone." The clinical terms I'd read about online were now being assigned to my son. My beautiful miracle son. "What does this mean?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Long term." Dr. Evans set the chart down. "This is a baseline, Jennifer, Mark. That's all today is. Starting point. The human brain, especially in infants, has a remarkable capacity for healing and adaptation called neuroplasticity. We don't know his ceiling. No one does." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "The question is not, what is wrong with him? The question we need to ask is, how can we help his brain build the connections it needs?" The prognosis for babies who survive bacterial meningitis varies widely. Some have lasting challenges. Many, with early and aggressive intervention, go on to catch up and lead perfectly normal lives. Early and aggressive intervention. The words hung in the air. "What does that mean?" "Yes. It means physical therapy," she said. "Starting next week. Twice a week. It means occupational therapy to help with his sensory issues and feeding. Means a structured, consistent routine at home. You are going to become his full-time therapists, in a way." She gave us a small, encouraging smile. The good news is that he is strong. He is a fighter. We have that on excellent authority from his picket team. And he has 2 parents who clearly love him very much. That is the most important factor of all. She handed us a packet of papers, referrals, instructions, exercises to start at home. It was overwhelming. It was a roadmap for a journey we never wanted to take. We drove home in silence. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining under the streetlights. Caleb was asleep in his car seat, exhausted from the ordeal. The diagnosis, or rather, the lack of a clear one, was a strange, heavy blanket smothering us. There was no answers, only a long, uncertain path of work. When we got home, we laid Caleb in his crib. We stood there together, looking down at him, the packet of referrals from Dr. Evans feeling like a lead weight in my hand. "So," Mark said, his voice hollow. "This is it. This is our new normal." I nodded, tears finally spilling over. They weren't the hot, angry tears of the hospital, or the terrified tears of the waiting period. They were tears of grief. Grief for the easy, simple infancy I had imagined for my child. Grief for the future we might have had. Mark put his arm around me. "We'll do the therapy," he said, his voice gaining a little strength. "We'll do everything. We'll help him." "I know," I whispered. It's not what I prayed for." "I know," he said, pulling me closer. "But he's here, Jen. He's here. And we're not losing him." As I looked at my sleeping son, the ghost of the hospital finally took a solid, tangible form. It wasn't just the memory of the beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic anymore. It was this packet of papers. It was the word delays. It was the terrifying, open-ended question of his future. And I realized the battle wasn't over. We had just left one battlefield for another. This one would be fought not in a sterile room with ventilators, but on a physical therapist's mat, in our own living room, day after grueling day. The enemy wasn't a bacteria with a clinical name. It was the silent, invisible threat of what might have been lost. I had prayed for a child for 12 years. I had nearly lost him to death. Now I faced the prospect of a different kind of loss, the loss of the future I had dreamed for him. And as I stood there in the dim nursery, I felt a fresh, cold wave of doubt wash over me. Did I have the strength for this new fight? Did my faith have anything left to give? The first physical therapy appointment was in 6 days. It felt like a lifetime and no time at all. The physical therapist's name was Maria, and she came to our house carrying a bag of colorful toys and a quiet, unshakable confidence. The first session was one of the hardest hours of my life. It was supposed to be about helping him, but to me it looked like torture. Maria would place Caleb on his stomach on a mat. He would immediately cry, his face pressed into the blanket, his arms and legs flailing weakly. He couldn't lift his head. He couldn't push up on his arms. He just lay there, helpless and furious. "Come on, Caleb," Maria would coax in her gentle but firm voice, rolling a small, bright ball just inches from his face. "Look at the ball. Can you lift your head to see it?" He would scream harder, his cries becoming ragged gasps of outrage. I sat on the couch, my body rigid, fighting the urge to snatch him up and tell her to leave. This was my miracle baby, and we were making him suffer. Mark stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching. "He hates it," I said, my voice tight. "He's in distress." Maria looked up, her eyes kind but unwavering. "He's in frustration, Jennifer. There's a difference. His brain knows what to do, but the pathways are muddy and his muscles are weak. We have to help him build the road between the thought and the action. It's hard work, but he can do it." She showed us how to do the exercises for just minutes at a time, many times a day. "Little and often," she said. "Make it part of your routine." The packet of papers from Dr. Evans was no longer an abstract concept. It was a relentless daily schedule of tummy time, leg bicycling, and gentle stretches that made my son cry. In between those mandated minutes, I found myself trying to create a perfect, peaceful world for him. I kept the house silent, tiptoeing around, jumping at any sound that might startle him. I was so focused on not overwhelming him that I ended up smothering him in silence. Our home became a museum, and Caleb was the fragile exhibit at its center. The strain between Mark and me, which had briefly eased, returned with a vengeance. He saw the therapy as a necessary challenge, a project to be tackled. I saw it as a violation of the sacred bond one was supposed to have with my son. One night, after a particularly difficult day of therapy and fussiness, we had a fight. It started over something stupid, a dish left in the sink. "I'm just so tired, Mark," I snapped, slamming the cupboard door. "I'm the one doing these exercises with him all day long while you're at work. I'm the one he screams at. And then you come home and want to play with him like everything is normal, and it's not. Nothing is normal." Mark turned from the stove where he was making pasta. "What do you want me to do, Jen? Quit my job? I'm doing this too, you know. I'm here every night, I do the exercises with him, I read the therapy notes. It's not the same." I interrupted, tears of self-pity and exhaustion springing to my eyes. "You get to leave. This house, it feels like a prison. A very, very quiet prison." He put down the wooden spoon he was holding. "Maybe it feels like a prison because you've made it one," he said, his voice low. "You've put him in a bubble, Jen. You tiptoe around him like he's going to break. He needs to experience the world, not be protected from it. After everything he's been through." I shot back, incredulous. "He needs peace. He needs life," Mark countered, his voice rising. "He needs to hear the vacuum cleaner and the doorbell and us laughing. How is his brain supposed to learn what normal is if we never show him?" We stood there, glaring at each other across the kitchen, the gulf between us wider than ever. He thought I was coddling Caleb. I thought he was being reckless. We were both terrified, and our fear was wearing two different masks. The next day, I was exhausted and resentful. Maria came for her second session. Caleb, predictably, started crying the moment she put him on the tummy time mat. I sat on the couch, arms crossed, feeling like a failure as a mother and a wife. But this time Maria did something different. She didn't just coax him. She laid down on the floor right next to him, her face level with his. "I know, buddy," she murmured. "It's so hard. So hard. But you are so strong." She stayed there, her presence a calm anchor in his storm of frustration. She didn't rush him. She didn't force him. She just waited. And then something miraculous happened. Caleb's crying subsided into hiccuping sobs. He strained, his little neck trembling with the effort. And for one breathtaking second, he lifted his head. It was just a centimeter off the mat, and it only lasted for a heartbeat before it flopped back down. But he had done it. Maria looked up at me, her eyes shining. "Did you see that?" she whispered. I had seen it. A sob caught in my own throat. It wasn't a milestone. It was a victory. Tiny, hard-won, beautiful victory. After Maria left, I looked at Caleb, who was now sleeping peacefully in my arms, exhausted from his effort. I thought about what Mark had said. About the bubble. About life. I took a deep breath. I walked over to the stereo, a thing we hadn't turned on in weeks. I pressed play on a CD of gentle folk music that Mark and I used to listen to. The sound filled the house, a soft, melodic intrusion into our silence. Caleb stirred in his sleep but didn't wake up. I then took him into the kitchen and started making lunch, talking to him in a normal voice about what I was doing. "Okay, Caleb, we're going to make a sandwich. Here's the mayonnaise. It's cold." The knife clinked against the plate. The refrigerator hummed. It was just life. He slept through it all. When Mark came home that evening, he stopped inside the door listening. The music was still playing. I was vacuuming the living room rug, Caleb strapped to my chest in a baby carrier, his head lolling against me with the rhythm of the movement. Mark didn't say anything. He just looked at me, and the relief and love in his eyes was so potent it felt like a physical touch. He walked over, kissed my forehead, and then kissed Caleb's head. The vacuum cleaner roared on. We were starting to find our way. Not back to the people we were before, that was impossible, but forward as the people we were becoming. Few days later a package arrived. It was from Nana. Inside was a small, soft baby blanket and a note. The note didn't mention God or faith. It simply said, "For when the world feels too big, wrap him in this and remember your own strength. It's in there, even when you can't feel it. I love you." I held the blanket to my face. Smelled like her house, like lavender and sugar cookies. Smelled like safety. I draped it over the back of the rocking chair in Caleb's nursery. That night, as I was feeding him before bed, I looked around the room. The blue walls, the cloud mobile, the new blanket. It wasn't a museum anymore. It was just a baby's room. And my son wasn't a fragile miracle anymore. He was a little boy who had a hard start, who was working hard to catch up, who loved the sound of the vacuum and the feeling of being held close. I had prayed for a child for 12 years. I had almost lost him. I had almost lost my faith. But as I rocked my son in the quiet dark, I realized something. My faith hadn't disappeared in the hospital. It had been broken apart and was now being slowly, painfully, reassembled into something new. Something less certain but more real. Something that could live in the same room as fear and doubt and a long, uncertain road. I kissed Caleb's head as his breathing deepened into sleep. We had survived the earthquake. Now we were learning to live in the new landscape. The change didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, gentle turning like the earth toward the sun. The physical therapy sessions didn't get easier, but my heart toward them did. I started to see them not as a punishment, but as a partnership. Maria and I, and Mark and I, were all on the same team, with Caleb as our determined, fussy, incredible captain. We celebrated the tiniest of victories. The first time he pushed up on his arms for a full 3 seconds, the day he finally, successfully rolled from his back to his stomach. His face a perfect picture of surprised accomplishment. Our house was no longer silent. We played music, sometimes soft, sometimes loud and silly. We let the doorbell ring. We laughed, real laughs, that didn't feel guilty or forced. Mark started a ritual of dancing with Caleb in the living room every evening after work, swinging him gently through the air to some old rock song. At first, Caleb would just stare wide-eyed. Then one night we heard it. A sound that stopped us both in our tracks. A giggle. A real, bubbling, joyful baby giggle. Mark's eyes met mine over Caleb's head, and we both froze, afraid to break the spell. Then Mark spun him again, and the giggle turned into a full-bellied laugh that filled the entire house. It was the sound of pure, uncomplicated joy, a sound I feared the meningitis had stolen. We were getting pieces of him back. Not the baby we had imagined, but the baby he was, and he was wonderful. The tension between Mark and me didn't vanish, but it lost its sharp, cutting edge. We were tired, but we were tired together. We started talking again, not just about therapy schedules and doctor's appointments, but about our days, about a movie we wanted to watch, about a memory from before. The connection felt weathered and scarred, but stronger for it, like a bone that had broken and healed. One Sunday morning we were getting ready for the day. The sun was bright, and Caleb was in a good mood, babbling at his reflection in a toy mirror. Mark was making pancakes and I was sipping coffee, watching them. "We could try church," Mark said, his back to me as he poured batter onto the griddle. He said it casually, but I could hear the careful hope in his voice. My first instinct was to tense up. Church was where I had felt the most invisible during our years of waiting. It was where I had smiled through baby dedications with a hollow ache in my soul. The thought of going back, of being the couple with a special needs child, of having to answer well-meaning but painful questions, made my skin crawl. "I don't know," I said quietly. "We don't have to," he said, turning around. "It was just a thought. Dr. Evans said new experiences are good for him." "I don't know. I just miss it sometimes." I looked at Caleb, who was now chewing on the corner of his blanket, Nana's blanket. I thought about the long, quiet journey from the despair of the PICU to this messy, noisy, pancake-scented kitchen. I thought about Ben, the respiratory therapist, whose faith wasn't a shield against pain but a companion through it. "Okay," I said, the word surprising me as much as it surprised Mark. "But we sit in the back. And we leave if he gets overwhelmed." So we went. We dressed Caleb in a little blue outfit and drove to the building we hadn't entered in over a year. My palms were sweaty as we walked through the doors. A few people recognized us, their eyes widening with surprise and then softening with kindness. They didn't swarm us. They just smiled and nodded, giving us space. We sat in the very last row, as promised. Caleb was fascinated by the high, vaulted ceiling. When the music started, he jumped, his lower lip trembling. I clutched him closer, ready to bolt. But then the congregation began to sing, and the sound wasn't a scary noise. It was a wave of hundreds of voices, a collective breath. Caleb stilled, listening, his eyes wide. I didn't sing. I just stood there, holding my son, letting the music wash over me. They began to sing "It Is Well," the very hymn Ben had hummed in our darkest hour. The words I had found so cruel in the hospital now felt different. "When sorrows like sea billows roll." I looked at Mark, who was singing softly, his voice rough with emotion. I looked down at Caleb, who was now peacefully sucking his thumb, nestled against my chest. The sorrow had rolled. It had threatened to drown us. But we were still here. Our family was battered, but we were intact. "Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." It wasn't well with my circumstances. My son still had a long road of therapy ahead. There were still days of fear and frustration. But in that moment, I realized a quiet miracle had been happening all along. The miracle wasn't that everything was fixed. The miracle was that my soul had found a way to be well, even when nothing else was. It was well because I had learned to be honest with God in my anger. It was well because my husband and I had chosen to bridge the distance between us. It was well because a nurse named Anna and a therapist named Maria and a respiratory therapist named Ben had been the hands of God when I couldn't feel his presence. It was well because my grandmother's love arrived in the mail at the exact right time. The redemption I had been looking for hadn't come in a dramatic, theatrical healing. It had come quietly, in the daily, grueling work of healing. It had come in the forgiveness Mark and I offered each other in our failures. It had come in the grace to love the child I had, not the child I thought I was promised. After the service, an older woman I didn't know stopped us. She didn't fuss over Caleb. She just looked at him, then at me, and her eyes were deep pools of knowing. "He's beautiful," she said simply. "The road is long, but the journey is holy." Her words settled in me. The journey is holy. Even this one. Especially this one. We drove home, the three of us, the silence in the car comfortable and full. When we got home, I laid Caleb down for his nap in his crib, tucking Nana's blanket around him. He sighed, a soft, contented sound, and closed his eyes. I stood in the doorway, watching him sleep. I had prayed for a child for 12 years. I had gotten my miracle. And when he came, I almost lost my faith because I was looking for God in the thunder, in the dramatic rescue. I almost missed him in the quiet, steadfast love that showed up in the beeping silence of a hospital room, in the stubborn hope of a husband, in the strengthening of a child's neck muscles 1 millimeter at a time. My faith was different now. It was smaller, perhaps, but denser. It had been tested in the fire, and what remained was a core of something real, something that could bear the weight of a long, holy journey. I turned and walked out, leaving the door open just a crack.